I never thought I'd see the day when my own parents would betray me so completely. Standing in our family's grand living room, I watched in shock as my father announced they were giving my $10 million inheritance entirely to my sister Amanda. The inheritance that my grandfather had promised me. The money that was rightfully mine. My father's cold eyes fixed on me as he ordered me to leave our family estate immediately. Confused and desperate, I ran upstairs to pack a small bag of personal belongings when my mother stormed in, her face twisted with rage. "You're not taking anything from here. Hand over that bag." When I refused to surrender my few possessions, my father grabbed me by my hair and dragged me through the house. As he threw me onto the driveway, I warned them through my tears that they would deeply regret this decision. I had information they didn't know about. To understand how things reached this breaking point, you need to know about my family. I'm Barbara Winters, granddaughter of Theodore Winters, a self-made real estate tycoon who built an empire from nothing. While my parents, James and Diane, spent their lives enjoying the wealth without contributing much, my grandfather saw something different in me. From the time I was 10 years old, Grandpa Ted would invite me to his office on weekends. While my sister Amanda went shopping with our mother or lounged by the pool posting selfies, I sat beside my grandfather learning about property values, contract negotiations, and business ethics. "Barbie," he'd say, using his special nickname for me. "Paying attention to details will make you successful. But treating people right will make you significant." Amanda would roll her eyes whenever I talked about these lessons. My parents weren't much better. Dad would change the subject, and Mom would make comments about how I should focus more on normal teenage things. But Grandpa Ted and I shared a bond that went beyond business. He understood my analytical mind and nurtured my interest in architecture and urban development. On my 21st birthday, Grandpa Ted took me to dinner at his favorite steakhouse. Over dessert, he became unusually serious. "Barbara, I've watched you grow into a remarkable young woman. You have both the intelligence and the heart to continue what I've built." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "When I'm gone, you'll inherit the bulk of my estate. The companies, the properties, all of it. I've set up trusts for your parents and sister, but you're the one who understands the responsibility that comes with this kind of wealth." I was stunned. "Are Mom and Dad okay with this?" I asked. His expression darkened slightly. "They'll be taken care of, but this is my decision to make. I've already discussed it with my attorneys. For the next 5 years, Grandpa Ted involved me more directly in the business. I completed my MBA and started working alongside him, learning the operation from the inside. Amanda, meanwhile, drifted between expensive hobbies and failed relationships, always with her hand out for more money. My parents continued their socialite lifestyle, hosting elaborate parties and taking extended European vacations. When Grandpa Ted was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer, everything changed. He fought bravely, but within 6 months, his once powerful frame had withered. During his final weeks, I noticed my parents spending unusual amounts of time in his room with the door closed. Whenever I entered, conversations would abruptly stop. At the time, I attributed it to private family matters and grief. The morning Grandpa Ted passed away, I was holding his hand. My parents and sister arrived at the hospital an hour after he was gone. Amanda looked annoyed at being summoned so early, and my mother's grief seemed performative at best. 3 months of somber preparation followed. The funeral was elaborate, attended by business associates and political figures from across the country. Through my grief, I tried to honor my grandfather by maintaining his business operations. My parents, oddly, began taking more interest in company matters, requesting access to documents and accounts that had never concerned them before. Then came the day of the will reading. I arrived at our family estate feeling a strange mix of grief and hope. This would be the day I'd officially take on my grandfather's legacy. I wore a conservative black dress that Grandpa Ted had always complimented. My hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Amanda showed up in designer sunglasses despite the cloudy day, scrolling through her phone impatiently. The family lawyer, Mr. Peterson, arrived carrying his leather briefcase. I'd known him for years as Grandpa's trusted advisor and expected a straightforward reading of the will I'd already discussed with my grandfather. But as he set up his papers in the study, I noticed something odd in his demeanor. He avoided eye contact with me, focusing instead on my parents who seemed unusually tense yet somehow satisfied. "Before we begin," Mr. Peterson said, clearing his throat, I want to express again my condolences to the family. Theodore was not just a client but a dear friend. My mother nodded dramatically, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Mr. Peterson began reading the legal preamble, but something felt wrong. The wording wasn't what Grandpa Ted had described to me. Instead of specific bequests, there were vague references to family distribution. My stomach tightened as Mr. Peterson continued. And so I leave the entirety of my estate, including all business holdings, properties, and liquid assets, to my son James and his wife Diane, with the understanding that they will fairly distribute these assets between my beloved granddaughters, Barbara and Amanda. I gasped. This couldn't be right. This wasn't the will Grandpa Ted had described to me repeatedly over the years. I looked at Mr. Peterson, expecting him to correct himself or explain. Instead, he avoided my gaze, shuffling papers nervously. There must be some mistake, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My father cleared his throat. No mistake, Barbara. Your grandfather changed his mind in his final months. He realized that Amanda and you should be treated equally, and that your mother and I should oversee the distribution. I stared at the document in disbelief. The signature looked like my grandfather's, but something about it seemed off. The flourish at the end of his name was missing, a detail only someone who had studied his signature would notice. May I see the will? I asked, reaching for the document. Mr. Peterson hesitated but handed it over. As I scanned the pages, I noticed the paper was different from what my grandfather typically used for legal documents. The date of signing was during a week when Grandpa Ted had been heavily medicated for pain. And strangest of all, the notary's name was unfamiliar to me. Not the longtime notary my grandfather had used for decades. I said nothing about these discrepancies, but I carefully photographed each page with my phone while pretending to read closely. Something was very wrong, and my grandfather had taught me never to show your hand too early. I returned the document to Mr. Peterson with a neutral expression, though my mind was racing with questions and suspicion. If there are no other questions, Mr. Peterson said, closing his briefcase with finality, the estate will transfer to James and Diane, effective immediately. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. Amanda smiled for the first time that day, suddenly interested in the proceedings, and I sat there, feeling the first tremors of an earthquake about to shatter my world. Later that evening, I knocked on my father's study door. I needed answers, and I hoped that in private, away from Amanda and Mr. Peterson, my parents might be honest with me. Dad was at his desk, already going through Grandpa's business files. Dad, can we talk about what happened today? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He barely looked up. What's there to talk about? The will was clear. But that's not what Grandpa told me. For years, he said. People say a lot of things, Barbara. My mother interrupted, entering the room with a glass of wine. Your grandfather changed his mind. You'll need to accept that. When did he change it? He never mentioned anything to me, even during our private conversations in his final weeks. My father's jaw tightened. Are you suggesting we're lying? No, I just want to understand. This is completely different from everything he told me. Did something happen? Did I disappoint him somehow? Don't be so dramatic, Mom said, avoiding my eyes. Ted simply realized that family equality was important. Amanda deserves her fair share. I never said she didn't deserve anything. Grandpa had trusts set up for both of you and Amanda. But the business holdings were supposed to enough. My father snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. The will is final. Your mother and I will determine how to distribute the assets. This discussion is over. I left the study feeling hollow. Their defensiveness only deepened my suspicions. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something wasn't adding up. My grandfather was meticulous about his plans and had never given any indication of changing his will. If he had, wouldn't he have told me directly? The next morning, I began my investigation. While my parents were out meeting with the bank, I searched my father's study. In his filing cabinet, I found overdue notices for their credit cards, showing balances in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Hidden behind tax documents were letters from their financial advisor warning about their unsustainable spending habits. One document revealed they had taken a secret second mortgage on their vacation home in Aspen. My parents, it seemed, had been in serious financial trouble for years, despite the generous allowance Grandpa Ted provided them. Their extravagant lifestyle had been a house of cards on the verge of collapse. Digging deeper, I found a folder containing communications with Winters Development Group, my grandfather's primary company. There were copies of wire transfers showing large sums being moved from company accounts to offshore holdings. The transactions were authorized with my father's signature, despite him having no official role in the company. The dates coincided with periods when Grandpa Ted had been hospitalized. I carefully photographed everything before returning the documents exactly as I had found them. Then I reached out to Frank Carter, my grandfather's longtime financial controller and someone I trusted implicitly. We met at a quiet coffee shop far from the family properties. Frank looked nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. "I was wondering when you'd call me," he said, his voice low. "Things haven't been right for months." "What do you mean?" Frank sighed. "Your father started showing up at the office after your grandfather's first hospitalization. He demanded access to accounts, claiming Ted had authorized him to streamline operations. When the accounting department questioned some transfers, staff started getting reassigned or fired. Why didn't anyone tell me? Your father made it clear that anyone who contacted you would be terminated immediately. Most people have families, mortgages. They couldn't risk it." Frank hesitated. "There's more. The company's being systematically drained. Major assets are being liquidated at below-market rates to shell companies. I've been tracking it quietly, but I'm careful. Your father's hired new security personnel who monitor employee communications. Do you think my parents altered Grandpa's will?" I asked. Frank looked down at his coffee. "I can't say for certain, but a new lawyer showed up about 2 months before Ted passed, Harvey Simmons. Slick guy from downtown, not the type Ted would typically work with. Your parents spent a lot of time with him behind closed doors. That name was new to me, not Mr. Peterson. Peterson only came back into the picture after your grandfather died." He looked uncomfortable at the office, like he was following a script. I thanked Frank for the information and asked him to keep our meeting confidential. As we parted, he gripped my arm. "Be careful, Barbara. Whatever's happening, it's bigger than you think. Your parents seem desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." Over the next week, I expanded my investigation. Using my still active company email, I accessed the visitor logs for my grandfather's home during his illness. Harvey Simmons had visited 6 times, always when I was known to be elsewhere. I also discovered that my mother had replaced several of my grandfather's longtime household staff with new people during his final months. I hired a private investigator to look into Harvey Simmons. The report confirmed my suspicions. He specialized in estate manipulation and had been implicated in several questionable will changes, though never formally charged. His office shared an address with a company my father had recently established. Then I made my most disturbing discovery. While my parents were attending a charity gala, I searched their bedroom and found a hidden compartment in my mother's closet. Inside was correspondence between my parents and Simmons, explicitly discussing how to alter my grandfather's will before his death. One letter referenced ensuring Barbara remains unaware until everything is finalized. Most shocking was an email printout from my sister Amanda to my parents. "I don't care what you have to do. Just make sure I get what I deserve from the old man's fortune. Barbara's had his attention all these years. It's my turn now." I photographed everything with shaking hands. My own family had conspired against me and my grandfather. They had taken advantage of his illness, possibly coerced him when he was too weak to resist, and systematically worked to steal what he had built and intended for me. That night, as I sat in my room processing what I'd learned, my laptop chimed with an email notification. It was from Frank. "They know I talked to you. My access has been revoked. Watch your back." The next day, Amanda cornered me in the hallway, her expression smug. "So, have you accepted the new reality yet? Dad says you've been asking too many questions. I'm just trying to understand Grandpa's wishes," I replied carefully. She laughed. "His wishes? Please. The old man is gone and things are going to be different now. Mom and Dad promised me the vacation properties and enough cash to never work again. You should be grateful they're keeping you on the company payroll at all." "You knew about this all along," I said, the realization hitting me fully. "Of course I did. Why should you get everything just because you brown-nosed Grandpa for years? I put up with this family just as much as you did." As she walked away, I felt a chill. The depth of the betrayal was staggering. My sister hadn't just benefited from the scheme. She had been an active participant. And if they were all willing to go this far, what else might they do to protect their secret? For the next 2 weeks, I meticulously documented every piece of evidence while pretending nothing was wrong. I backed up all digital files to secure cloud storage and kept physical copies with a trusted friend from law school. I contacted Timothy Walsh, a lawyer specializing in estate fraud who had no connections to my family or their associates. Based on what you've shown me, Timothy said during our consultation, there appears to be substantial evidence of will tampering. The inconsistencies in the document itself, the suspicious timing, the financial records showing misappropriation of funds even before your grandfather's death. These all point to a coordinated effort to defraud both your grandfather and you, so we can challenge the will. We can, but we need more concrete evidence linking your parents directly to the fraudulent document. The correspondence you found is compelling but could be explained away as discussions about legal estate planning. What we need is testimony from someone involved in the actual creation or signing of the falsified will. What about the notary on the document? Timothy nodded. That's one avenue. We'll need to locate and interview them. There's also the matter of your grandfather's mental capacity at the time of signing. If he was heavily medicated, as you've indicated, that alone could invalidate the will. While building my legal case, I maintained a careful facade at home. I attended family dinners, making bland conversation while my parents discussed how they would redistribute my grandfather's assets. My father had already installed himself as CEO of Winters Development Group, despite having no real understanding of the business. My mother was planning extensive renovations to all the family properties, and Amanda was shopping for a Manhattan penthouse with her sudden windfall. During one particularly tense dinner, I casually asked, "Dad, how was Grandpa feeling when he signed the new will? I'm just curious since he never mentioned it to me." My father and mother exchanged glances. "He was having a good day," Dad said firmly. "Very clear-headed." "That's interesting," I replied, because according to his medical records, he was on triple his usual morphine dose that entire week. His doctors noted he was rarely conscious for more than 20 minutes at a time. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. "How would you know that?" "I was his medical proxy. I have copies of all his records." My father's face darkened. "You're obsessing over this, Barbara. It's not healthy. Your grandfather made his decision. You need to respect it and move on. Just like you respected him when you started emptying company accounts while he was fighting for his life." The words slipped out before I could stop them. The table fell silent. Amanda stared at her plate. My father slowly set down his wine glass. "I don't know what you think you know," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "But I suggest you be very careful about making accusations you can't back up." "I'm not accusing anyone," I said, trying to backpedal. "I'm just confused about the timing and circumstances." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but the damage was done. I had revealed too much about my suspicions. That night, I heard my parents arguing behind closed doors, my name mentioned repeatedly in angry tones. The next morning, I discovered my laptop was missing from my room. After searching frantically, I confronted Amanda, who I'd seen sneaking out of my room earlier. "Looking for something?" she asked with fake innocence. "Where's my laptop, Amanda?" "Oh, that old thing? Dad needed to check some company files he thought you might have. Something about unauthorized access to confidential information. That's my personal property." "He has no right, actually," she interrupted. "Everything in this house belongs to Mom and Dad now, including your precious laptop. Grandpa Will made that clear, remember?" I struggled to control my temper. "What is wrong with you? How can you be part of something so dishonest? Grandpa loved you too, you know. He provided for you in his real will." Her expression hardened. "Not like he provided for you. Always perfect, Barbara. The heir to the throne. Do you have any idea what it's like living in your shadow? Hearing about brilliant Barbara and her business acumen while I got lectures about responsibility and wasting potential. So this is revenge for feeling overlooked. This is me finally getting what I deserve. And if you were smart, you'd stop digging before you lose what little you have left." That evening, my parents called me into the study. My laptop sat open on the desk, clearly having been searched. My father's expression was cold with fury. "We know what you've been doing," he said without preamble. "Accessing company records without authorization, meeting with Frank Carter, who has now been terminated for violating confidentiality agreements, consulting with an outside attorney about family matters." Those records belong to a company my grandfather built for me to lead, I replied, my voice stronger than I felt. And there would be no need for outside counsel if the will actually reflected his wishes. My mother stepped forward. We've indulged your tantrum long enough, Barbara. The fact is, your grandfather recognized that you aren't ready for the responsibility he initially planned for you. Your obsessive behavior since his death only confirms that. That's not true, I said. You manipulated him when he was sick and vulnerable. You took advantage of his condition to steal what he spent a lifetime building. My father slammed his fist on the desk. Enough! We are your parents. Everything we've done has been for this family's benefit. Your grandfather made poor business decisions in his final years. We're correcting those mistakes. By draining company accounts? By selling assets at a loss to your shell corporations? That's for the family's benefit. You've been given every advantage, he continued as if I hadn't spoken. The best schools, connections most people would kill for. And this is how you repay us? With accusations and schemes? My mother's voice turned syrupy sweet, a tone she always used when manipulating. Darling, we understand you're grieving. We all miss Ted. But this destructive behavior needs to stop. We've decided it would be best if you took some time away from the business and the family. You're firing me from Grandpa's company. We're putting you on a leave of absence, my father corrected. And given your emotional state, we think you should move out of the house for a while. You're kicking me out? Because I questioned a suspicious will. We've made our decision. Amanda will be taking over your responsibilities at the company. She's shown a surprising aptitude for the work. Amanda, who had been listening from the doorway, smiled smugly. As for your inheritance? My father continued. We've reconsidered the distribution. Given your recent behavior and Amanda's newfound commitment to the business, she'll be receiving the bulk of the estate. You'll get a modest trust fund, enough to live comfortably if you're reasonable. I stood there in shock, the full betrayal washing over me. You're giving my $10 million inheritance to Amanda? After everything Grandpa wanted for me? After all my years learning the business? It's not your inheritance, my mother snapped, her sweet facade cracking. It's our money to distribute as we see fit. And frankly, your ingratitude has made this decision quite easy. This is theft, I said, my voice shaking. Grandpa would be ashamed of all of you. My father's face contorted with rage. You have 24 hours to leave this house. Pack your things and go. Fine, I said, turning to leave. But this isn't over. One more thing. My father called after me. Any company property in your possession needs to be returned immediately. That includes your company car, phone, and access credentials. I spent that night packing essential items, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. In less than a month, I had lost my grandfather, my inheritance, my job, and now my home. My own family had orchestrated it all, watching me with cold eyes as my world collapsed around me. In the morning, as I was finishing my packing, my mother appeared in my doorway. She surveyed my suitcase with narrowed eyes. What do you think you're doing? Leaving, as instructed, I replied without looking up. You're not taking anything from here. Hand over that bag. I stared at her in disbelief. These are my personal belongings. Clothes, photos, things I've had since childhood. Everything in this house belongs to us now, she insisted, reaching for my suitcase. I pulled it back. No, you've taken enough. She called for my father, who came thundering up the stairs. When I refused again to surrender my few remaining possessions, he grabbed me by my hair and began dragging me toward the stairs. The pain was shocking, but the humiliation was worse. Amanda watched from her doorway, making no move to intervene as I struggled and cried out. My father dragged me through the house by my hair, past the family portraits, past the living room where I'd spent countless hours with my grandfather, out the front door, and onto the circular driveway where my car sat, packed with the few things I'd managed to put there earlier. He released me with a shove that sent me sprawling onto the gravel. Consider yourself lucky we're not pressing charges for corporate espionage, he spat. If you cause any more trouble, well, make sure you regret it. The family name still carries weight in this town. Through tears of pain and rage, I looked up at the three of them standing in the doorway of what had been my home for 26 years. My mother's cold stare, my sister's satisfied smirk, my father's threatening posture. You think you've won? I said, my voice low but steady. But Grandpa taught me more than just business. He taught me that truth always finds a way. You will regret this decision more than you can possibly imagine. My father slammed the door, and I was alone. The sound of that slamming door echoed in my mind as I sat in my car, my scalp still burning from where my father had pulled my hair. Tears streamed down my face, but beneath the pain and humiliation, something else was building. Determination. Resolve. A cold clarity about what needed to be done. I had nowhere to go. My closest friends from college had scattered across the country for their careers. My romantic relationships had always taken a back seat to my work with my grandfather, leaving me without the comfort of a partner during this crisis. For a moment, the magnitude of my isolation threatened to overwhelm me. Then I remembered Jackson Reynolds. Jackson had been my grandfather's business partner in the early days, before they amicably split their ventures. Unlike many of Grandpa Ted's associates who had been gradually pushed out by my parents in recent months, Jackson had maintained his independence. He had always been kind to me, sending thoughtful gifts on my birthdays and asking insightful questions about my education when we met at industry events. I drove to a coffee shop with secure Wi-Fi and emailed Jackson, explaining my situation as succinctly as possible. Within 30 minutes, my phone rang. "Barbara? My God, is what you wrote true?" Jackson's familiar gravelly voice was filled with concern. "Every word," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "They've taken everything, Jackson. The company, the estate, my home. They're giving my inheritance to Amanda." "Where are you now?" "In my car. I have nowhere to go." "That's nonsense. You come straight to my guest house. Sarah and I have plenty of room, and nobody will look for you here." Relief washed over me. "Are you sure? I don't want to put you at risk." Risk? Ted Winters was my friend for 40 years. The thought that James and Diane would do this to his legacy, to you, it's despicable. You come here, and figure out next steps. Jackson's sprawling Tudor home in the suburbs felt like entering another world. Sarah Reynolds, his wife of 35 years, welcomed me with a warm hug and took one look at my red eyes and disheveled appearance before declaring, "You need food, a hot bath, and rest. In that order. Questions and plans can wait until morning." I spent that first night in their guest house cycling between tears of grief, rage, and exhaustion. But by morning, the fog had begun to clear. Over breakfast with Jackson and Sarah, I laid out everything I knew, from the suspicious circumstances of the will to the evidence of financial misdeeds I'd discovered. Jackson listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he shook his head sadly. "Ted suspected something like this might happen, you know. Not to this extent, perhaps, but he knew James had always resented living in his shadow. That's part of why he was so intent on preparing you to take over." "Then why change the will?" I asked. "I don't believe for a second that he did, at least not willingly. The Ted Winters I knew would never have gone back on his word to you, especially not to hand control to James and Diane." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "What's your plan, dear?" "You strike me as someone who always has a plan." "First, I need to secure my position," I said. "Right now, I'm homeless, jobless, and my parents are probably already telling everyone I had some kind of breakdown. I need to re-establish myself before I can fight back effectively." I was about to elaborate when my phone chimed with an alert from my banking app. I stared at the screen in disbelief. "They've frozen all my accounts, every single one." Jackson's face darkened. "They're trying to make you desperate, force you to come crawling back on their terms." "It won't work," I said, feeling a cold resolve solidify within me. "Grandpa always taught me to prepare for worst-case scenarios. I have an emergency account at a different bank under my middle name. Not much, but enough to get started." Over the next few days, I discovered just how thorough my parents' attack had been. Not only had they frozen my accounts, but they were also spreading rumors among family, friends, and business associates that I had suffered a mental breakdown after my grandfather's death. According to their narrative, I had become delusional, making wild accusations and threatening the family, forcing them to distance themselves for safety. I learned this from Martha, my mother's former college roommate who had always had a soft spot for me. She called Jackson's house, one of the few people who knew I might be there. "Barbara, I don't believe a word of it," Martha assured me. "But you should know they're telling everyone you're unstable and potentially dangerous. They've even suggested you might have tried to manipulate Ted in his final days. They're trying to discredit me before I can challenge them. I realized aloud. There's more, Martha said hesitantly. They've hired Dale Griffin to track your movements. My blood ran cold. Dale Griffin was a private investigator known for his aggressive tactics and questionable ethics. He had worked for my father before on business matters. Thank you for warning me, Martha. Please don't tell anyone we spoke. After hanging up, I sat with Jackson in his home office, recalibrating my approach. They're moving faster than I anticipated. They must be worried about what evidence I managed to secure. Jackson nodded. You've rattled them. Good. Guilty people make mistakes when they're frightened. But I need to be careful now. If they're watching for me, any wrong move could undermine my case. What's your next step? I took a deep breath. I need legal representation. First and foremost, Timothy Walsh seemed promising, but I need someone who can stand up to the kind of pressure my parents will bring to bear. Then I need to secure testimony from people who can verify the will tampering. For the legal side, Jackson said thoughtfully, you should talk to Elizabeth Chen. She was Ted's original estate attorney before he supposedly switched to Peterson. If anyone would know about his true intentions, it would be her. As for funds, Sarah and I can help you get back on your feet. I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking. We're offering. Consider it an investment in justice. With Jackson and Sarah's support, I began rebuilding. I moved into their guest house officially, using a different name when coming and going to avoid detection. I purchased a used car with cash, registered under a LLC Jackson helped me establish. I set up secure communication channels and began methodically contacting people who might help my case. Elizabeth Chen agreed to meet me at her office after hours, away from prying eyes. A formidable woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair and piercing eyes, she got straight to the point. I drafted 3 versions of Ted's will over the years, she explained, pulling files from her cabinet. The final version, completed 8 months before his death, left the bulk of the estate directly to you, with specific provisions for your parents and sister. Ted was explicit about his wishes and his reasoning. Do you have a copy of that will? Of course. Ted also kept a copy in his personal safe, and another with his private banker. Did neither of those surface? No, I said grimly. Just the version Peterson presented, leaving everything to my parents. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. Peterson wasn't even handling Ted's estate matters. I was. At least until I received a letter supposedly from Ted dismissing my services 3 months before he died. The signature looked off, but I had no grounds to challenge it. The letter was fake, I said. My parents engineered the whole thing. I suspected as much, but couldn't prove it. This new will you described, it's completely contrary to Ted's expressed wishes. He wanted you to lead his companies, Barbara. He was adamant about that. Armed with Elizabeth's testimony and copies of the legitimate will, I began building my case in earnest. But I knew documentary evidence alone wouldn't be enough. I needed people willing to testify about what had actually happened during my grandfather's final months. One by one, I reached out to staff members who had been let go after my grandfather's death. Many were hesitant, afraid of retaliation from my parents, but a few, loyal to my grandfather's memory, agreed to help. Lisa, a home health nurse who had cared for my grandfather, confirmed that my parents had strictly controlled access to him in his final weeks. He asked for you often. She told me over coffee in a quiet restaurant 30 miles from town. But they would tell him you were too busy at the office. He seemed confused by that. Said it didn't sound like you. Marcus, my grandfather's driver for 15 years, reported overhearing heated arguments between my parents and grandfather. The last big one was about a week before he became too weak to get out of bed. Your father was shouting about family loyalty and how your grandfather was betraying him by cutting him out of operational control. Your grandfather responded that the company wasn't a birthright. It had to be earned. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle, strengthening my resolve. But I knew my parents wouldn't surrender without a fight. They had resources, connections, and the presumption of legitimacy on their side. I would need to be strategic, patient, and above all, prepared for their countermoves. One evening, as I was reviewing documentation with Timothy Walsh, who had agreed to take my case despite the risks, my secure phone rang. It was Frank Carter, my ally from the company. Barbara, you need to know something, he said urgently. Your parents are liquidating assets at an alarming rate. They've sold 3 major properties in the last week, all at below market value for quick cash. They're also transferring funds to accounts in the Caymans and Switzerland. They're preparing to run if things go bad. I realized, that's my read. At this pace, they could move a significant portion of the estate offshore within weeks. Once that money leaves the country, it becomes much harder to recover. I finished. Thank you, Frank. Be safe. After hanging up, I turned to Timothy. We need to move faster. They're trying to empty the estate before we can challenge the will. Timothy frowned. We're still building our case. Going to court prematurely could backfire. Then we need to find a way to freeze the assets while we complete our preparations. Can we file for an emergency injunction based on what we know so far? It's risky, he admitted, but given the new information about asset liquidation, we might convince a judge there's enough evidence of potential fraud to warrant a temporary freeze. That night, as I lay awake planning our next moves, I received a text from an unknown number. Parking garage. Level 3. Tomorrow 8 a.m. Come alone. Information about the will. It could be a trap, but it could also be the breakthrough I needed. Either way, I knew the time for playing defense was ending. The real fight was about to begin. The parking garage felt cavernous and ominous in the early morning light. I had arrived 30 minutes early, parking 3 blocks away and approaching on foot to ensure I wasn't followed. I carried a small canister of pepper spray in my pocket and had Timothy Walsh on standby, ready to call authorities if I didn't check in by 8:30. At precisely 8 o'clock, footsteps echoed through the concrete structure. A slender woman in a housekeeper's uniform emerged from the shadows. I recognized her immediately as Elaine Sanderson, my grandfather's longtime housekeeper who had mysteriously retired 2 weeks before his death. Miss Barbara, she said softly, glancing nervously around. Thank you for coming, Elaine. I tried to find you after Grandpa passed. Mom said you'd moved to Arizona. She shook her head. That was their story. They fired me with a warning to stay away from the family if I wanted my severance package. I've been working at the Lakeside Hotel, keeping my head down. Why the secrecy? Why meet like this? Elaine's hands trembled slightly. Because I know what they did to Mr. Ted's will. I saw it happen, and I have proof. My heart raced. What kind of proof? I should have come forward sooner, she said, guilt etching her features. But they threatened my son's college scholarship. Your father said he'd make sure Jimmy lost his funding if I ever spoke about what I saw. What did you see, Elaine? 2 days before Mr. Ted took a turn for the worse, your parents brought in a man I didn't recognize. They took him to the study with Mr. Peterson. Your grandfather was heavily sedated that day. They wheeled him in, propped him up. The man had papers. They put a pen in Mr. Ted's hand, moved it for him. He wasn't conscious, Miss Barbara. He couldn't have known what he was signing. You witnessed them forging his signature on the new will. I whispered. Yes, and when Mr. Peterson objected, your father threatened him. Said something about offshore accounts in Peterson's name that could cause problems if he didn't cooperate. They were blackmailing Peterson too. I realized. The pieces were falling into place. There's more, Elaine said, reaching into her bag. I was scared, but I knew it was wrong, so I used my phone. She handed me a USB drive. I recorded them through the cracked door. The video isn't perfect, but you can see and hear what happened. I've kept it safe, waiting for the right time. I stared at the small device that could change everything. Elaine, this is incredibly brave of you. Mr. Ted was good to me for 20 years. He deserved better than to have his wishes ignored. Her eyes filled with tears. He loved you, Miss Barbara. He was so proud of you. After ensuring Elaine was safely away, I rushed to Timothy's office. We viewed the video together, hardly daring to breathe. Though somewhat grainy and shot from an angle, it clearly showed my sedated grandfather being manipulated into signing documents. My father's voice was unmistakable as he instructed Peterson and the unknown man on positioning my grandfather's hand. Most damning of all was my mother's cold comment. Now Barbara will learn she's not as special as Ted made her believe. The company should have been Jameis all along. This is exactly what we needed, Timothy said, his professional demeanor breaking into a rare smile. With this evidence and the testimonies we've gathered, we have a solid case for will fraud. We need to move quickly, I reminded him. They're still moving assets offshore. I'll file for an emergency injunction this afternoon. This video should be enough to convince a judge to freeze the estate pending investigation. Over the next week, we worked tirelessly to build our case. While Timothy handled the legal preparations, I focused on gathering additional evidence of my parents' financial misconduct. Through Frank Carter and other loyal employees, I obtained records of suspicious transactions, improper asset transfers, and potential tax evasion stretching back years. I also worked on a broader strategy. My grandfather had always emphasized that business battles are won not just in courtrooms but in the court of public opinion. My parents were prominent figures in our community, their charitable foundation and social events carefully crafted to maintain an image of generosity and integrity. I needed to be prepared for the publicity battle that would inevitably accompany the legal one. With Jackson's help, I connected with Alicia Dominguez, a respected financial journalist who had written extensively about corporate governance and inheritance disputes. Off the record, I shared enough of my story to pique her interest, suggesting there might be a major story brewing about fraud and elder abuse in one of the city's most prominent families. She promised to keep an eye on court filings and be ready if the story broke publicly. Meanwhile, I discovered my sister had been careless with her digital security. Years ago, when Amanda had locked herself out of her email, I had helped her recover her account. She had never changed the recovery information, allowing me access to her current communications. I hesitated, knowing this was ethically questionable, but the stakes were too high for niceties. Amanda's emails revealed the full extent of her complicity. She had actively encouraged my parents to alter the will, suggesting they wait until my grandfather was on his strongest pain medications to present the documents. She had also been in contact with potential buyers for company properties, negotiating kickbacks for herself separate from what my parents had promised her. Most troubling were exchanges with Dale Griffin, the private investigator, where she specified my routines and habits to help him track me. Armed with this intelligence, I could anticipate their next moves. When Griffin started questioning people at my gym and favorite coffee shops, I was already operating under a different identity and routine. When my parents attempted to cancel my health insurance and credit cards, I had already established alternatives. The final piece of my preparation involved the family lawyer, Mr. Peterson. According to Elaine's video, he had been coerced into cooperation through some form of blackmail. If I could flip Peterson to our side, his testimony would be invaluable. I arranged to accidentally encounter Peterson at a restaurant I knew he frequented for lunch. Sitting alone at the bar, I pretended surprise when he walked in. "Mr. Peterson," I said quietly as he passed. "Funny running into you here." He startled, clearly uncomfortable. "Barbara, I didn't expect to see you. I heard you left town." Just stepping back, gaining perspective. "May I buy you a drink?" His eyes darted nervously. "I don't think that would be appropriate, given the circumstances. One drink, for old time's sake. For Grandpa Ted." The mention of my grandfather's name hit its mark. Guilt flashed across Peterson's face, and he reluctantly took the seat beside me. I kept the conversation casual at first, asking about his family, reminiscing about holidays at my grandfather's estate where he had been a regular guest. Only after his second scotch did I gently steer toward the matter at hand. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about Grandpa's final days," I said softly. "About the people who were there, the decisions that were made." Peterson stiffened. "Barbara, I can't discuss your grandfather's estate matters with you. It would be unprofessional, even when those matters involved fraud," I asked, keeping my voice low. "Even when you were forced to participate against your will." His hand trembled slightly as he set down his glass. "I don't know what you're implying." "I know about the offshore accounts in your name," I said, taking a calculated risk based on Elaine's information. "The ones my father used to pressure you. I also know you didn't want any part in changing Grandpa's will." Peterson's face paled. "How could you possibly? I have video, Mr. Peterson, of the day my grandfather supposedly signed the new will while barely conscious. I can see how uncomfortable you were, how my father pressured you." He closed his eyes briefly. "You have no idea the position I was in." "I think I do. And I want you to know that when this goes to court, and it will go to court, I'm prepared to show that you were a victim of my father's manipulation, not a willing participant." Hope flickered in his eyes. "What are you asking of me?" "The truth, just the truth. About Grandpa's real will, about what my parents did, about how they coerced you. You were his friend for 30 years. Don't let this be your legacy with him." Peterson was silent for a long moment. "They'll destroy me professionally. Not if we move first." My lawyer has connections with the Bar Association. If you come forward voluntarily, admit to being coerced, and help rectify the situation, there's a path to redemption. If we have to expose you through other means. I left the implication hanging. He signaled for another drink. I need to think about this. Of course, I said, standing to leave. I placed my card on the bar. But don't think too long. Things are moving quickly now. 3 days later, Peterson called. I want to make things right, he said simply. With Peterson's cooperation secured and our legal case building, I felt the tide beginning to turn. But there was one final vulnerability I needed to address. If my parents suspected defeat was imminent, they might attempt to empty what remained of the estate before a court could intervene. I needed to know exactly what assets remained and where they were held. Late one evening, Jackson called with urgency in his voice. Barbara, my contact at First National just tipped me off. Your parents have scheduled wire transfers for tomorrow morning. $30 million to accounts in Switzerland and Singapore. Can your contact block the transfers? Not without court orders. Once that money moves, it's effectively beyond reach. I called Timothy immediately. We need that injunction now. Tomorrow will be too late. I've been pushing the judge, but these things take time. We don't have time. Tell the judge that if he doesn't act by morning, there will be nothing left to adjudicate. And I'm going to need a copy of whatever emergency orders he can provide. Immediately upon issuance, Timothy promised to do what he could, working through the night if necessary. I then reached out to Frank Carter with specific instructions for the morning. If we couldn't stop the transfers through legal means, we needed a backup plan. I barely slept, checking my phone every hour. At 5:30 in the morning, Timothy called. We got it. The judge signed an emergency order freezing all assets of the estate pending a hearing next week. I'm emailing you the documents now. I forwarded the court order to Frank with a message. Implement Plan B. The transfers must not process. At 9 o'clock, my secure phone rang. It was Frank, sounding breathless. It worked. When your parents' financial team tried to process the wire transfers, the bank flagged the accounts as being under legal dispute. Your father is currently shouting at the bank president, threatening lawsuits if they don't release the funds. And the court order. I made sure copies were delivered to every financial institution holding estate assets. Nothing's moving without judicial approval now. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a genuine smile. We had stopped the bleeding. Now it was time for the real battle to begin, a battle for justice, for my grandfather's true legacy, and for the truth to finally come to light. The downtown courthouse loomed before me, its limestone facade imposing against the bright blue sky. Timothy Walsh stood beside me on the steps, projecting confidence despite the gravity of the moment. Remember, he said quietly, no matter what accusations they make, what tactics they try, stay composed. The evidence speaks for itself. Inside, the courtroom was already buzzing with tension. My parents and Amanda sat at the respondents' table, flanked by a team of 3 attorneys from Preston and Haywood, one of the most expensive law firms in the state. My father glared at me, while my mother studiously avoided eye contact. Amanda was texting furiously, seemingly unbothered by the proceedings that would determine all our futures. Judge Eleanor Sawyer entered, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency. After preliminary introductions, my parents' lead attorney, William Preston himself, launched their defense with practiced smoothness. Your Honor, this case is, at its heart, about a young woman's inability to accept her grandfather's final wishes, Preston began. Miss Winters had certain expectations about her inheritance. When those expectations weren't met, rather than accepting the deceased's decisions with grace, she has manufactured a conspiracy theory involving her own parents. He went on to paint me as mentally unstable, describing my erratic behavior following my grandfather's death, my obsessive focus on his business, and my delusions about promises made to me. Preston presented affidavits from family friends, all dependent on my parents' social connections, testifying to my supposedly deteriorating mental state. Furthermore, Preston continued, the will in question was properly executed, witnessed, and notarized. Miss Winters has produced no credible evidence suggesting otherwise, only hearsay and conjecture. We ask that the emergency freeze on the estate assets be lifted immediately, allowing Mr. and Mrs. Winters to continue honoring their father's legacy through proper management of his estate. When it was our turn to present, Timothy approached the bench with calm determination. Your Honor, we're not here because Barbara Winters is a disappointed heir. We're here because Theodore Winters was the victim of fraud, perpetrated by his own son and daughter-in-law. We have evidence that the will presented after Mr. Winters' death was not only inconsistent with his clearly documented wishes, but was executed when he was physically incapable of understanding or consenting to its contents. Timothy presented the timeline of events, the suspicious circumstances surrounding the creation of the new will, and testimony from Elizabeth Chen regarding my grandfather's true intentions. He then played a portion of Elaine's video, the courtroom falling silent as they watched my sedated grandfather being manipulated into signing documents. My father's face darkened with rage. My mother whispered urgently to Preston, who was clearly blindsided by the video evidence. Amanda's phone dropped to the table with a clatter. Additionally, Timothy continued, we have evidence of systematic financial misconduct by the respondents, including improper transfers of estate assets, attempts to move funds offshore, and self-dealing transactions that have already diminished the estate's value by millions. The judge listened intently, asking occasional clarifying questions. When Timothy finished his presentation, Preston requested a recess to confer with his clients, which Judge Sawyer granted. In the hallway, I stood with Timothy, discussing strategy for the cross-examination phase, when I noticed a commotion near the elevator. A distinguished older man with a cane was making his way toward the courtroom, accompanied by a younger assistant. Is that Harold Bennett? Timothy asked incredulously. I recognized him immediately. Harold Bennett had been my grandfather's attorney for decades before retiring 3 years ago. He had handled my grandfather's most sensitive business matters and had been something of a mentor to me during my college years. I hadn't been able to locate him when building our case had been traveling abroad, according to his office. Mr. Bennett, I called, walking toward him. I didn't know you were back in the country. Barbara, he said warmly, taking my hands in his. I came as soon as I heard what was happening. Your grandfather was my oldest friend. I couldn't stand by while his wishes were perverted. How did you find out about the case? Elizabeth Chen tracked me down in Portugal. I've been following the proceedings remotely, but when she told me about the emergency hearing, I knew I had to be here in person. When court reconvened, Preston adopted a more aggressive stance, attempting to discredit Elaine's video as potentially manipulated and questioning my motives and mental stability more explicitly. During a particularly pointed attack suggesting I had attempted to coerce my grandfather into favoring me, Harold Bennett rose from his seat in the gallery. Your Honor, may I address the court? He called out. Judge Sawyer peered at him over her glasses. And you are? Harold Bennett. Your Honor. I served as Theodore Winters' personal attorney for 32 years before my retirement. I have direct knowledge of his estate planning intentions, Preston immediately objected. Your Honor, Mr. Bennett is not on the witness list. This is highly irregular. So is attempting to defraud a dying man of his rightful wishes, Bennett replied sharply. I've flown 5,000 miles to ensure Theodore's true intentions are honored. After some deliberation, Judge Sawyer allowed Bennett to testify as a surprise witness, noting the unusual circumstances of the case. Bennett took the stand with dignified confidence, explaining his long history with my grandfather and their extensive work on estate planning. He then delivered the bombshell. Theodore Winters executed a video will addendum with me 6 months before his death, Bennett stated. In it, he explicitly confirmed his intention for Barbara to inherit control of his business interests and the bulk of his estate. He also expressed concerns that his son James might attempt to challenge these arrangements. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Video will addendums were relatively uncommon but carried significant legal weight when properly executed. And where is this video now, Mr. Bennett? Judge Sawyer asked. I have it with me, Your Honor, Bennett said, producing a sealed envelope. As instructed by Mr. Winters, it was to remain sealed unless his primary will was contested. Given the current proceedings, I believe the conditions for its disclosure have been met. Judge Sawyer ordered a short recess to review the video in chambers with both legal teams present. 20 minutes later, they returned, Preston looking noticeably deflated and Timothy quietly confident. The court finds the video testament to be properly executed and consistent with state law regarding will addendums, Judge Sawyer announced. Its contents directly contradict the will currently being administered and strongly support the petitioner's claims of fraud. She continued, addressing my parents directly. In light of this evidence and the troubling financial activities revealed by the petitioner, I am extending the freeze on all estate assets and appointing a special administrator to oversee the estate pending a full trial on the merits of the case. My father stood abruptly. This is outrageous. That video could easily have been coerced, or Mr. Winters. Judge Sawyer cut him off sternly. I suggest you sit down and confer with your counsel before making statements that could further complicate your position. As my father reluctantly returned to his seat, I felt a wave of vindication wash over me. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a critical first step. The court had seen through their deception, and my grandfather's true wishes were finally being acknowledged. Following the hearing, Preston approached Timothy and me with a markedly different demeanor than his earlier courtroom bravado. My clients would like to discuss the possibility of settlement, he said stiffly. Timothy smiled. I'm sure they would, now that the tide has turned. But given the evidence of deliberate fraud and financial misconduct, we'll need to include discussions of potential criminal liability in any settlement talks. Preston paled slightly. Criminal charges would not be in anyone's interest. This is a family matter that should be resolved privately. It stopped being merely a family matter when they falsified legal documents and attempted to liquidate assets in violation of their fiduciary duties, I replied. But we're willing to hear what they propose. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, forensic accounting, and tense negotiations. The special administrator discovered even more financial irregularities than we had initially uncovered, including previously unknown offshore accounts and questionable transactions dating back years before my grandfather's illness. My parents, seeing their position deteriorating rapidly, became increasingly desperate to reach a settlement that would shield them from criminal prosecution. Amanda, suddenly realizing the gravity of her complicity, attempted to distance herself from the scheme, claiming she had been manipulated by our parents just as my grandfather had been. Throughout this period, unexpected allies continued to emerge. Former employees who had been silenced by fear now came forward with additional evidence of my parents' misconduct. Business associates of my grandfather shared conversations where he had explicitly discussed his succession plans centered around me. Even some of my parents' social circle began to shift allegiances as the truth became more widely known. Most surprisingly, Mr. Peterson, the family lawyer who had participated in the will fraud under duress, fully cooperated with the investigation. He provided detailed testimony about how my father had blackmailed him using fraudulent offshore accounts created in his name without his knowledge. His cooperation proved instrumental in unraveling the full extent of my parents' scheme. As the case progressed, Alicia Dominguez published a series of investigative articles in the financial press, exposing not just my family's situation but similar patterns of elder abuse and inheritance fraud across the country. Her reporting sparked wider conversations about protecting vulnerable seniors and ensuring their final wishes were honored. 4 months after the initial emergency hearing, we approached the final resolution. The special administrator had recovered most of the diverted assets, though some funds had been irretrievably spent. The forensic accounting had laid bare years of financial mismanagement by my parents, both of the estate and their own affairs, and most importantly, my grandfather's authentic will had been located in a safe deposit box that Elizabeth Chen had helped us identify. On the day of the final hearing, the courtroom was packed with observers, including business reporters and members of the local legal community. The case had drawn attention not just for its family drama but for the significant estate planning and elder protection issues it highlighted. Judge Sawyer called the court to order, reviewing the extensive evidence and expert testimony presented over the preceding months. Her summary was methodical and damning, laying out in clear terms the deliberate fraud perpetrated by my parents and the substantial evidence supporting my claims. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, Judge Sawyer concluded, this court finds that the will dated March 15th was fraudulently created and executed without Theodore Winters' knowing consent. The court recognizes the previously executed will dated September 3rd of the prior year, along with the video addendum, as Theodore Winters' true and final testament. She turned to address my parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Winters, the court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office for consideration of criminal charges related to fraud, elder abuse, and financial misconduct. The severity of these potential charges will likely be influenced by your cooperation in returning all diverted assets and making restitution for funds already expended. My father, once so imposing in his power and confidence, seemed to physically diminish in his seat. My mother clutched her designer handbag with white knuckles, her carefully maintained facade cracking to reveal raw fear. Amanda, sitting slightly apart from our parents, caught my eye for the first time in months. There was no smug superiority now, only a complex mixture of regret and uncertainty about her future. As Judge Sawyer finalized her rulings on the distribution of the estate according to my grandfather's authentic will, I felt no triumph or vindication, only a profound sense of relief that the truth had finally prevailed. My grandfather's legacy would be preserved, not just in terms of the wealth he had created, but in the values of integrity and responsibility he had worked so hard to instill in me. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and flanked by Timothy and Jackson, I made a brief statement. Today isn't about winning or losing. It's about honoring my grandfather's wishes and the lifetime of work he dedicated to building something meaningful. I'm grateful to the court for seeing through the deception and allowing his true legacy to continue. As the crowd dispersed and the cameras turned away, Harold Bennett approached me with a warm smile. Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of you, Barbara. Not just for fighting for what's rightfully yours, but for how you fought with dignity, persistence, and integrity. I learned from the best, I replied, emotion catching in my throat. Indeed you did, he agreed. Now comes the hard part, rebuilding what's been damaged and carrying his vision forward. Looking up at the clear blue sky, I felt my grandfather's presence more strongly than I had since his passing. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in months, I faced it with hope rather than fear. The truth had prevailed, and with it came the opportunity to honor my grandfather's legacy in the way he had always intended, with me at the helm, guided by the values and wisdom he had so carefully instilled. 1 year later, I stood at the podium in the newly renovated conference room of Winters Tower, addressing the assembled employees, business partners, and press. The room had been redesigned according to sketches my grandfather had made years ago but never implemented, with warm wood panels replacing the cold marble and large windows maximizing natural light. Today marks not just the 1-year anniversary of regaining control of Winters Development Group, I began, but a celebration of renewal and recommitment to the principles my grandfather built this company on: integrity, innovation, and community investment. The past 12 months had been both exhausting and exhilarating. After the court's ruling, I had faced the monumental task of stabilizing the company, which had suffered under my parents' brief but damaging control. Key personnel had left, important client relationships had frayed, and financial irregularities had undermined our reputation in the industry. With Jackson Reynolds acting as interim chairman, we had assembled a new executive team, combining experienced industry veterans with young, innovative thinkers. Frank Carter had been promoted to CFO, his loyalty and financial acumen proving invaluable during the transition. Elizabeth Chen had come out of semi-retirement to serve as our general counsel, helping us navigate the complex legal aftermath of my parents' actions. When I look around this room, I continued, I see the true strength of this company not in its buildings or balance sheets, but in its people. Many of you stood by the company during its darkest hours. Others joined us during this year of rebuilding, bringing fresh perspectives and energy. Together, we've not only recovered from the crisis but emerged stronger. The numbers backed up my words. Today, I'm proud to announce the creation of the Theodore Winters Foundation for Entrepreneurial Innovation. I revealed, unveiling the foundation's logo on the screen behind me. With an initial endowment of $50 million, this foundation will provide mentorship, education, and seed funding to young entrepreneurs who demonstrate not just business acumen, but a commitment to ethical leadership and community impact. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. This foundation had been my personal priority, a way to honor my grandfather's legacy beyond just preserving his business empire. He had often spoken about wanting to help young people with drive and integrity but limited resources, remembering his own humble beginnings. My grandfather believed that true success is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute and who you become in the process. This foundation will embody that philosophy, helping to nurture the next generation of business leaders who understand that profit and purpose can and should go hand in hand. As the event continued, I mingled with employees and partners, discussing ongoing projects and future plans. Many expressed their appreciation for the stability and renewed sense of mission I had brought to the company. A few shared personal stories of how my grandfather had impacted their careers and lives, reinforcing my commitment to honoring his example. Later that evening, I hosted a smaller gathering at my condominium for those who had been instrumental in helping me reclaim my inheritance and restore my grandfather's legacy. Timothy Walsh was there with his wife, as were Jackson and Sarah, Frank Carter, Elizabeth Chen, Harold Bennett, Elaine Sanderson, and a few others who had stood by me during the darkest days. Over dinner, we reminisced about the challenging journey of the past 18 months and celebrated how far we had come. The conversation was lighthearted despite the serious trials we had all weathered together. "I have some news that might interest you all," Harold mentioned as we moved to the living room for coffee. "I heard from reliable sources that the plea deal for James and Diane was finalized yesterday." The room quieted. My parents' fate had been a complicated emotional issue for me. While I had wanted justice, I had struggled with the implications of sending my own parents to prison. "What were the terms?" I asked. 5 years of probation, significant community service, and financial restitution. They avoided jail time primarily due to your willingness to recommend leniency." I nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. My decision to advocate for a reduced sentence had surprised many, including my parents themselves. But as my grandfather had often said, revenge might feel good for a moment, but justice with mercy endures. "Have you heard anything about Amanda?" Sarah asked gently. This was an even more complicated subject. Unlike my parents, who had maintained their innocence and shown little remorse until faced with overwhelming evidence, Amanda had eventually approached me privately, without lawyers present, and offered a tearful apology. "She's working at a marketing firm in Seattle," I replied, starting over completely, away from the family name and reputation. "We've had a few conversations in the past couple months. They've been difficult but necessary." "Do you think reconciliation is possible?" Timothy asked. I considered the question carefully. With Amanda, eventually perhaps. She was always following our parents' lead, though that doesn't excuse her actions. With my parents, I honestly don't know. They've lost everything they valued, their social standing, their lifestyle, their reputation. That kind of loss either transforms people or embitters them further. Time will tell which path they choose. What I didn't share with the group was the letter I had received from my father the previous week, the first direct communication since the final court hearing. It had been brief but unexpected in its tone, acknowledging his wrongdoing without excuses and expressing regret not just for the legal consequences but for the damage to our relationship. I hadn't responded yet, unsure whether it represented a genuine change of heart or simply another manipulation. "Enough about the past," Jackson said, raising his coffee cup. "Tonight we celebrate Barbara and the remarkable leader she's become." Ted would be bursting with pride. As my friends offered their agreement, I felt a wave of gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this without all of you," I said sincerely. "You believed in me when I had lost everything, when even I had moments of doubt. You're my true family." Later, after my guests had departed, I stood on my balcony overlooking the city lights. So much had changed in my life, some of it painfully, but I had emerged stronger and wiser. The inheritance I had fought for wasn't just the material wealth and business holdings, but my grandfather's principles and vision, which now guided my every decision. The hardest lesson had been learning that those closest to you can sometimes be the ones who hurt you most deeply. My parents' betrayal had shattered my understanding of family and trust. Yet through that devastating experience, I had discovered a deeper kind of family, one formed not by blood but by shared values and mutual respect. I had also learned about my own resilience, finding strength I never knew I possessed. When faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles, I had persevered, strategized, and ultimately prevailed. Not through cunning or cruelty, but through determination and a commitment to truth. Perhaps most importantly, I had learned the difference between justice and vengeance. In my darkest moments after being thrown out of my home, I had fantasized about seeing my parents and sister suffer as I had suffered. But as the case progressed, I realized that true justice wasn't about inflicting pain but about restoring balance and truth. That understanding had led to my most controversial decision, establishing the modest trust funds for my parents and Amanda despite their betrayal. Many had questioned this choice, seeing it as naive or overly forgiving, but I knew it wasn't about forgiveness so much as living up to my grandfather's example. He had always provided for family, even when they disappointed him, not out of weakness, but from a place of strength and principle. As I looked out over the city my grandfather had helped build, I felt his presence more strongly than ever before, not as a ghost or supernatural force, but as the values and wisdom he had instilled in me, now fully integrated into my own character and choices. "I did it, Grandpa," I whispered to the night sky. "I protected your legacy, and I promised to build on it in ways that would make you proud." The $10 million inheritance I had fought for had never really been about the money. It had been about honoring my grandfather's wishes, about truth prevailing over deception, about standing up against injustice even when it came from those who should have protected me most. The real inheritance was the understanding that wealth brings responsibility, that business success and ethical leadership must go hand in hand, and that true family is defined by love and loyalty, not merely by blood. As I turned to go inside, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. The painful journey had transformed me, tempering my character like steel in fire. Whatever challenges the future might bring, I would face them with the wisdom gained from this crucible and the strength of my grandfather's enduring legacy. What would you do if your family betrayed you for money? Would you fight back or try to forgive and move on? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found my story meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more real-life experiences that might help others facing similar challenges. And if you know someone who's dealing with family betrayal or inheritance issues, please share this video with them. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I sincerely hope it brings some comfort or guidance to those going through difficult times with their own families.